Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful historical morsels of British political history.
And in this episode, we're preparing for the 50th anniversary of the election of Margaret Thatcher as the first woman leader of the Conservative Party. But first, we begin our podcast each week with a segment called Matters of Interest, where we discuss something interesting we've read, listened to, or learned in the previous week. Richard, why don't you kick us off?
Well, the topic of today's podcast is about the election of the first woman who would become British Prime Minister. Now, the United States has yet to elect a woman president, but there are women who are serving in the top state-level offices as governors of the 50 states. After November's election, 13 women are now serving as governors of US states, and this is an all-time record. In the whole of American history, there have only been 50 women who have served as governor, and there has never been a black woman elected governor of any state. But what interested me about this topic is that women governors are not distributed equally across the states. 18 states have never had a woman governor, whereas New Hampshire just elected Kelly Ayotte, a Republican, and made her the fourth female governor of that state. But the record-holding state is Arizona, where 5 women have served as governor of that state, 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats, including the current incumbent, Katie Hobbs. Now, in contrast, I think this is quite interesting because Arizona neighbors a state with a very strongly liberal or progressive reputation, California, and yet California has never elected a woman governor. So what makes Arizona special? Well, part of it is about chance and contingency. Part of it is about misbehaving men who served as governor of Arizona, who had to resign, and then the person who was next placed to succeed them was a woman. But there must be something in the water in Arizona, because Arizona is also the only state in the United States where all of its elected executive branch officials have been women at the same time. In 1998, women were elected in Arizona as governor, secretary of state, attorney general, treasurer, and superintendent of public instruction, all in one election, and they were known as the Fabulous Five. So Lee, what's your matter of interest this week?
I thought I'd start with something that doesn't exist anymore, but I think that once made a very significant contribution to the Conservative Party, and that's called the Conservative Political Centre. It was founded after the Second World War, when the Tories were consigned to the opposition benches and Labour, as now, enjoyed an enormous majority in the House of Commons, and the CPC, as it was known, was the Tory party's political education wing. Its role was to foster vibrant, intellectually curious, and politically self-confident Conservatives by educating the grassroots, stimulating thinking about politics, discussing new policies, and also promoting conservative views among the wider public. Over the decades, the CPC would publish pamphlets and hold their own conferences and meetings around the country. Their lecture at the annual party conference was one of the flagship events every year. It was in giving one such lecture in 1968 that Margaret Thatcher sought to answer the question, "What's wrong with politics?" And she set out the principles that would one day become known as Thatcherism. The CPC was wrapped up in the 1990s as part of internal party reform, but I think a revived version could be just what the Tory party needs to rediscover its own political tradition and regain confidence in its own ideas. If we take an issue like housing, which has been much discussed in recent years, the CPC could publish pamphlets on how Harold Macmillan, for example, as a post-war housing minister, not only met but exceeded the target of building 300,000 new homes a year. It could host talks on the role of right to buy in the 1980s in making Britain more of a property-owning democracy, and also consider what it would mean for the new generation of aspiring homeowners. And it could also facilitate a genuinely national, intergenerational dialogue about what Conservative policy on home ownership should be. And what's more, by doing it in a way that is distinct from the party's front bench, He could do it without committing the party to any single policy. After so long in power, 14 years, now at an end, this period of opposition is going to be difficult for the Conservative Party, but it also affords the party a chance to really think again and rediscover its own tradition and ideas, and apply conservative thinking afresh to the new problems of today. And I think a revived Conservative political centre is something that could really play an important role in doing that.
Well, I would second that, Lee, and I would also say that the mirror image story could be said about the Labour Party, whose Labour Party research department in the post-war years was a major hub of serious thinking about policy and also attracted some very serious minds to work in it, often people who left university and will go on to do great things later on in the Labour Party. People like Dennis Healey, who did a great deal of development on foreign policy, and Peter Shaw, who then went on to become a very significant cabinet minister. And we have done a podcast episode on Peter Shaw if you want to go back and listen to that. But the topic of today's conversation is the 1975 Conservative Leadership Contest, which we mark the 50th anniversary of this month. Now, the prelude to that election, as so often is the case with a leadership election, was an election defeat. The Conservatives had lost the October 1974 election to Harold Wilson's Labour Party, which won a small majority. And there were, after that defeat, some calls for Heath to go. But I suppose what interests me about that is, of course, October 1974 was the second general election that the Conservatives had lost that same year. At the start of the year, in January of 74, Edward Heath called a general election in the midst of a miners' strike. This is the so-called Who Governs Britain election. And famously, the country decided it ought not to be Edward Heath and the Conservative Party, and the Conservatives lost office. So I'm wondering, why was Heath allowed to stay after the February 1974 election defeat, which turfed out him and the Conservative government?
This is absolutely a story that begins with Heath and ends with Thatcher. So let's start by thinking about Edward Heath a little bit. So he was a highly consequential leader of the Conservative Party and also Prime Minister of this country, but he was an electorally unsuccessful one. He led the party to 4 elections and lost 3 of them. As you say, it's a pretty poor record and not one that would be tolerated now. So the February 1974 election was undoubtedly a blunder. Heath called that election when he still had about 18 months to go in that parliament, but he called it, as people often call snap elections, thinking that he would win, but instead he lost. It was a very narrow loss, and to be fair, the Conservatives did win more votes than Labour, but they ended up with fewer seats. Everyone realised that the governing position after February 1974 election was not going to be sustainable for Harold Wilson and the Labour Party. And so they expected that there would be another general election coming in short order. So the general feeling was that there wasn't the time to indulge the party in a new leadership election after the February 1974, because the country could be asked to go back to the polls at almost any moment. But it's undoubtedly true, by the time Heath has gambled the government on that early election and lost, that some Tory MPs are beginning to fall out of love with their leader.
And after that second defeat in October 1974, was there any doubt at that point that it was time for Heath to resign?
In the mind of Edward Heath, there was no doubt at all. He was not resigning. He was an incredibly stubborn man. But an increasing number of Conservative MPs were beginning to think it was time for him to shuffle towards the exit. The 1922 committee, the trade union of backbench Conservative MPs, well, their executive met after the October election, and they were unanimous in their view that it was time for Heath to go. And Edward Ducan, the former party chairman, who now chaired the 1922 committee, was asked to meet with Heath and give their verdict. He did this. They sat down and they talked about the outcome of the election and what the feeling was among Conservative MPs in Parliament. And Ducan suggested a couple of things to Heath, either that he should resign as leader, which was the view of the executive of the 1922, or that he should call some sort of vote to try and renew his mandate as leader. But Buchanan was rebuffed and Heath wasn't having any of it.
But, if you look at Heath's record as leader, I mean, he led the Conservatives into 4 elections and lost 3 of them. Why on earth did he think after his 3rd election defeat that he could stay on?
Put bluntly, it was arrogance, I think. He didn't think anybody else could do as good a job as he could do. He was totally obsessed, totally committed to politics. It was the overwhelming obsession of his life. And he thought about it, to be fair, almost more than any of his colleagues. And he thought that meant that he was the one who could really drive the Tory juggernaut forward and take the party back into office. The context of that, of course, was a particularly chaotic time for the country. So as we've said, Labour's majority was tiny. The economy was in serious trouble. And his rival for the job of Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, had pledged to deliver a European referendum that was almost certain to split his cabinet and divide his party. So into this febrile atmosphere, Heath actually thought anything could happen. And certainly the idea of him returning to power as Prime Minister was not out of the question. There is another factor too, which I think it's worth commenting on. Heath was the first Tory leader ever to be elected. He was chosen by the party's MPs in 1965, whereas everybody before him had emerged as leader and was usually made leader as a consequence of being chosen to be Prime Minister by the monarch. Because Heath had emerged through a legitimate and democratic process, that gave him a particular mandate to lead, and one that he was not keen to throw away.
Okay, so you have a leader who's a 3-time election loser, but he doesn't want to leave the role of leader. So under the leadership rules of the time, how could a leadership election be forced upon Heath?
Here's the staggering thing. It couldn't be. The Tory party leadership at the time was a freehold, and there was no provision in the leadership rules for challenging or re-electing or bringing down an incumbent leader. There was a Tory MP called Nigel Fisher who once said of why this was omitted from the 1965 leadership rulebook, quote, "It had not occurred to anybody when the rules were first devised that a leader who had lost the confidence of a substantial section of the party would wish to continue in office," end quote. Heath had lost that support of a substantial section of the party. That was really quite clear. But he was not willing to succumb to that pressure in the way that many of his predecessors would have done. So the freehold, I think you can think of as almost being like the good chap's theory of party management, where it depends upon the idea that a leader who is under pressure will voluntarily go, and the party will not be forced to try and bring about a procedural way of kicking them out. And when those rules were devised, they hadn't reckoned with somebody like him who would simply refuse to go.
So we know that there was ultimately a leadership contest because Margaret Thatcher was elected. So what brought that leadership election about? Were the rules changed? Did Heath have a change of mind? What happened?
Yes, so the impasse had to be broken in some way. The party had a leader who didn't want to go. A lot of MPs thought it was time for him to go, and the rules didn't allow for a leadership contest that would bring that about. So in the end, the elections for the 1922 committee executive would prove a proxy for Heath's leadership. So allies of Heath put up a slate of candidates to challenge the existing 1922 committee leadership. They were the leadership who had called for Heath to go after the October 74 election. Now, this was a move which immediately backfired on the Heathites. For the first time, the entire executive committee were all re-elected. And it was a way of MPs saying that in their eyes, the executive had not been overstepping the mark when the 1922 committee dispatched Edward Buchanan to tell Heath it was time for him to go. But even then, even after this kind of proxy rejection of Heath and his slate of candidates, Heath did not fully see the writing on the wall. But he did concede at that stage that he had to agree to a revision of the leadership rules. And so he appointed a committee in order to revise those rules to end the freehold on the party leadership and introduce means of a challenge.
And what were those new rules?
So that question would be answered by Alec Douglas-Home, a former Conservative Party leader, former Prime Minister, former Foreign Secretary, very much a Tory grandee who was widely respected within the party. And he chaired a committee that proposed several amendments to the Tory party rulebook. The most important by far was a provision for a leadership contest to take place once per year, and it would either be within the first 4 weeks of a new parliamentary session, so that's after, at the time, the Queen's speech, now the King's speech, or in the case of Parliament meeting after a general election, no less than 3 months but no more than 6 months after the new Parliament assembled. Can you imagine? This sounds like a recipe for absolute chaos, having an annual leadership election. But that was what they proposed. And the way in which it was foreseen, I think, that leadership elections would then work is that the first round of a leadership contest would often become a no confidence vote on the incumbent. That if somebody decided to challenge a sitting leader, then there would be a vote on whether or not they wanted the incumbent or they wanted an alternative. But then under the Tory leadership rules at the time, unless one of those two parties achieved a supermajority on that first round, there would then be a second round in which new candidates could enter the contest and everything would open up. So given the date of the October 74 election and the febrile atmosphere among Tory MPs, this all but guaranteed a contest would take place early in 1975. The key question was whether or not Heath would win it, or whether or not he'd win it by enough to stay on, or whether there'd be a change of leader.
Well, I should also say that the rules under the Labour Party for most of Labour's history was annual elections. Ever since the Parliamentary Labour Party was founded in 1906, the annual general meeting of the Labour Party would consider a motion of the leader, and there was always an opportunity for the incumbent leader to be challenged. And of course, this is still how council groups operate still today, where they have an annual general meeting and they elect their leadership. So that didn't change actually in the Labour Party until the 1990s, when John Smith changed the rules for electing the leader.
On that point, it is actually worth saying that there was a reason to believe, partly from the example set by the Labour Party, that it wouldn't be a particularly chaotic or unstable model if they elected the leader every year. There was a proposal that was put to the committee chaired by Alec Douglas-Hume that it should only be done once per Parliament. And their fear was that if this became a potentially once every 5-year event, then the feeling would be it's now or never. That you've either got to put up with this person for a whole 5 years or you can get rid of them now. And that it would raise the stakes in the eyes of the MPs, in the eyes of the media, and the eyes of the public if you had this big once per Parliament ballot on whether or not the leader should stay in post. So partly for that sort of exact reason, you sort of take the drama out of a contest if you have it very frequently. And as we'd see, it actually worked out to be quite a stable model in the future.
Absolutely. It lowered the stakes, and it also gave the leader an opportunity to refresh his mandate. And in the whole history of the Labour Party under the rules of annual election, there was only one time in 1922 where the incumbent was successfully challenged, and that was when John Robert Clines was challenged by Ramsay MacDonald in 1922. But anyway, back to 1975. So entering that leadership contest, now that one is underway, how did Heath fancy his chances, and who was regarded as his main competition? Was Margaret Thatcher in the frame at that point?
Well, Heath very much thought that he would still win the contest. He was totally cut off from the feelings of backbench Conservative MPs. And he was rather helped, I think, in his delusions by the fact that most of the cabinet were united behind him. They did remain loyal. But there was then the great challenge for the anti-Heathites within the Tory party to answer the question, well, who should stand against him? Several names were discussed. Edward Buchan, as we've discussed, the chairman of the 1922 committee, was encouraged to stand, but he ultimately decided against it, partly amidst rumours about his business affairs, and also it seems that his wife was very opposed to him going for the job. Keith Joseph, an ideological guru really for free market, more libertarian thinking within the Conservative Party. He was widely discussed as a possible candidate for the leadership, but he decided not to go ahead with it after he made a controversial speech, which was accused of promoting eugenics. But one person confirmed very early on that she was willing to stand. She was willing to stand. And that was Margaret Thatcher. She was then the shadow chief secretary to the Treasury, and she went to see Heath in late 1974. It's reported that she told Heath that she would launch a challenge when the time come, and she recalled him as saying, "If you must, you'll lose." Now, rather to give away the fact that they would never agree on anything else again, pretty much for the rest of their lives, he denies saying any such thing, but I think we can probably take her word for it on that. It sounds like exactly the sort of dismissive, slightly high-handed thing that Edward Heath would have said to her.
I quite agree. Now, I'm quite interested in what made Margaret Thatcher jump into the ring, because right up until that point where she announced her candidacy, she was telling the press that she thought it was extremely difficult for a woman to be elected leader, that she had no interest in standing. And in a certain respect, that's something that many politicians who are ambitious do, is they profess not to have ambitions in that direction, and then, in fact, they actually do. But I'm not sure with Thatcher. I can't work it out. Do you think she had her eye on the leadership all along and was just being coy? Or do you think that she genuinely didn't see herself as a leadership candidate until the last minute and then changed her mind?
She was definitely an ambitious person. I mean, she is on the record as saying that she very much wanted to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. But you're right to say that certainly in British politics, there's nothing quite so vulgar as being honest about seeking the job that you ultimately desire a great deal. And so she never went around saying that she desperately wanted to be leader of the Conservative Party or Prime Minister. Did she, though? I think so. I think she definitely had this burning ambition. She went and told Heath that she was keen to stand as a candidate before it was clear that several of the other potential anti-Heath candidates wouldn't stand. She wanted to make sure that she was in a good position on the starting line whenever that contest would come about. Part of the reason for that ambition, I think, was that she increasingly had her own view of conservatism that she wanted to put forward, and that she wanted to replace the version that had been chosen by Heath, particularly after 1972 when things in his government start to go wrong. Heath had re-embraced policies around prices and income and relations with the trade unions, and that she thought had failed. And she wanted to try and show that there was a better, more conservative way, she would have thought, to achieve the goals of conservative and good government. This was very much also the view of Keith Joseph, who she was very closely aligned to. And in some ways, it's an open question as to whether she would have stood if Joseph was also determined to stand. Possibly not. But in the end, I think she was content that he didn't, and that she would get the chance to put herself and her case forward.
So what do people make of Thatcher's candidacy at that stage? Were expectations low? Was she seen as a fringe candidate? Or did people see her as a serious contender from the start? And if they didn't see her as a serious contender from the start, what did she do to make MPs take her seriously?
Undoubtedly, some people accuse her of being a stalking horse. A stalking horse is one of those slightly ridiculous terms that we hear bandied around quite a lot in the canon of Tory leadership elections. And what it typically means in the context of the Conservative Party is the idea that you will put up an unlikely candidate for the top job as a way of giving those who favour a change, who want to see a new leader, the opportunity to express their lack of confidence in the current one. But there would be no expectation that that candidate, the alternative candidate, the stalking horse, would win. Their candidacy would just be a gauge of the mood of the Conservative Party. But Thatcher definitely wasn't a stalking horse at all, and the term was used really as an attempt just to try and undermine her. She'd been a member of the cabinet, she remained a member of the shadow cabinet. She wasn't acting on behalf of anybody else in the way that a traditional stalking horse would, and she had significant support that made her, if not a likely leader at this stage, certainly a viable one. But the important thing really at this point of the contest is that she wasn't the favoured choice of a majority of Conservative MPs to be their leader. I think that's pretty obvious when you look back in the history. There were not enough MPs who at the beginning of the contest wanted her to replace Heath. And the task of getting her from being an also-ran to becoming the leader fell to a man called Airy Neave, who was the MP for Abingdon and would from early January become her campaign manager. So Neave had this really difficult job to try and get Thatcher to win the race. And he needed to unite two camps of people, those who wanted her as leader, which before the first ballot represented certainly less than a majority of Tory MPs, and those who wanted Heath out but didn't necessarily want Thatcher in. His strategy was to use a vote for Thatcher in round one as a means of simply removing Heath and nothing more. Vote for her, he would say, and there will be a second round in which other candidates could enter the contest. But if you want round two, and if you want to vote for your actual preferred alternative, you have to vote for her in round one. It was a pretty basic appeal to tactical voting, and in the end one that quite a lot of Conservative MPs found quite appealing.
So was there much of a campaign? I mean, the electorate is a couple of hundred Tory MPs. Did Thatcher or Heath experience any setbacks in this campaign?
Heath's campaign was pretty arrogant and aloof throughout, really. The biggest setback that the campaign for Edward Heath faced was Edward Heath himself. Peter Walker, who had ran his successful campaign in 1965, soon realised that there was very little affection for him on the backbenches. And Heath's biographer, John Campbell, I think perhaps put it best when he said, quote, "Tory MPs had been willing to put up with Heath's remoteness and rudeness so long as he was Prime Minister, but they felt no obligation or personal loyalty to such a graceless bore when he began to look like a loser." So he had really not put in the hard yards to win over his colleagues in Parliament, this very small electorate that you refer to, who were going to decide whether or not he stays in office. And that really showed throughout the contest. The only real sour moment for Thatcher in the lead up to this first ballot was that there was a slur against her as being a hoarder. So before the general election, she had given an interview in which she had offered some housewife's advice. Stock up on tinned goods. And then shortly after the general election, when this leadership campaign is underway, this was dug up and she was accused of hoarding lots of tinned goods in her kitchen. And for a generation that still remembered the criticism of unpatriotic hoarders during the Second World War, this was an attack that actually really wounded her. She recalled, quote, "Someone has clearly used this obscure interview in order to portray me as mean, selfish, and above all, bourgeois. In its way, it is cleverly done." And she was bitterly upset by it, and at one stage near to tears. And in the end, she resolved it by inviting the media to count the tins of food that she had in her own home. And when their tallies were found to be more consistent with sensible planning, shall we say, than hoarding, the story began to die down.
Controversy very much of its time. Was there anyone else who was standing for leader in this first round?
There was. So alongside Heath and Thatcher, you have a unexpected, slightly rogue third candidate, who was Sir Hugh Fraser. He was widely seen as a traditionalist Tory, and he was never really a serious candidate for the leadership. In fact, nobody really seemed to know why he was standing, including himself. He practically refused to campaign, and his biggest role in the contest was really seen as being the choice of Tory traditionalists who wanted rid of Heath, so it was a way of denying votes to him, but they were hesitant, as some undoubtedly were, to vote for a woman leader.
But in the end, Hugh Fraser only got 16 votes, just 6% of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And so the final result was really a Heath versus Thatcher contest, where 43% of Conservative MPs voted for Heath, 47% voted for Thatcher, and a further 4% didn't vote. So under the rules, although Thatcher did beat Heath by 11 MPs, this wasn't enough for her to win. I'd like you to interpret these results for us, because on the one hand, I think you could say that this was a stunning victory for Thatcher, who a few weeks earlier no one had really discussed as a contender for leader. But on the other hand, you could say maybe it wasn't that impressive a result, that in spite of having lost 2 general elections in 1 year, 43% of Conservative MPs thought that Ted Heath was the best choice of the three.
So I think the way to view this is certainly as a disaster for Heath. More than half of his MPs voted against him. So if you think of this as a straightforward vote of confidence or not, he lost it. And it was clear that whether they liked Thatcher or not, a majority of Tory MPs were willing to do what they had to do in order to get rid of him. For Thatcher, the result was seen as a shock. It was certainly a surprise performance. Earlier in the campaign, Erin Eve would go around telling people, Margaret is doing very well, but not quite well enough. And he basically meant not well enough to remove Heath, a way of encouraging people to back her. But in reality, she was doing a great deal better than most people expected.
And how did Heath react to this result?
Oh, angrily. I mean, he turned the air blue in his comments to some people about what the Tory party had done to him. But he did at least finally recognise the writing on the wall and resigned as leader. He thought of himself as being very much in reserve. He thought the Parliamentary Conservative Party had made a catastrophic mistake in getting rid of him. But in reality, his career in frontbench politics was over, and he began what would soon be known as the Incredible Sulk, this great sort of whinging period of time in his very long political career, where he failed to reconcile himself with the changes that Margaret Thatcher brought to both the Conservative Party and the country.
He certainly was a man with a high sense of his own value. Now, with Heath out, who were the main contenders? I assume this was an opportunity for some new runners and riders to enter into the race.
Definitely. So, as I mentioned, the way that the rules worked at the time, in the first round, the question was, do you want the current leader or not? And that meant that members of the cabinet or the shadow cabinet and the incumbent supporters couldn't stand in that contest because they were still backing the leader. But once Heath was out, his top team could enter the race. So most prominently of all, Willie Whitelaw stood for the leadership at this stage. And he was then the favourite of Heath's supporters, and he was the designated successor of the Heathites. Other candidates stood too, including some people who would become big names in Tory politics in the years ahead. They included Geoffrey Howe and Jim Pryor. But the second round was really seen as being a fight between Thatcher and Whitelaw. And the big question was, did she have enough momentum from the first round to hang on to her lead and win? Or had she actually just been a means of getting rid of Heath, and that Tory MPs would now pick somebody else when they had the chance to?
Well, looking at that second round result, it's a more crowded field, and Thatcher wins it decisively. She wins 146 MPs. In second is Willie Whitelaw, but just on 79. And then way down is Geoffrey Howe on 19, Jim Pryor on 19, and John Payton on 11. Now, again, this is on the one hand, a very important and stunning victory for Thatcher. But there is another way of looking at it, which is to say that between the two rounds, Thatcher's support increased by just 16 votes, which was the same number of votes that were cast for Hugh Fraser in the first round. And so mathematically, it's possible, although I would say practically not likely, that Thatcher didn't win any of the Heath supporters over to her side. She just simply gained the anti-Heath vote that had been slightly divided in the first round. How accurate do you think it would be to say that Thatcher was just consolidating the anti-Heath vote and the other candidates were just the Heath vote, but now fragmented into many forms?
I would be more generous to Thatcher than that. Heath's supporters estimated that around 40 MPs voted for her in the first round who didn't ultimately want her to become leader. They just wanted rid of Heath. So she certainly kept hold of those people too, or enough people, or she won over enough people to make up for losing some of them. Part of the reason why I think she gained support in this round is that there was a sense that she had been the brave one. She had been willing to put her neck on the line to get rid of Edward Heath as leader when very few other people would. And it's worth remembering that if she had failed in that task, if Heath had held on, that probably would have been the end of her political career. She wasn't a big enough name, she wasn't a big enough star to have commanded this sort of great support on the backbenches. Heath would have been done with her, and that probably would have been the end of Margaret Thatcher's frontline career. She would have been a footnote in history rather than one of its authors. So I think people respected that courage and felt that rather than, as is often said about these contests, he or she who wields a sword never wears the crown, that there was evidence for a different sort of mantra: to the victor, the spoils. She had won on the first round, and therefore she deserved to take on the leadership.
Now, Of course, people today remember Margaret Thatcher as a very successful prime minister for 11 years, a three-time election winner. And yet, actually, when she first started as leader of the opposition, she faced a much choppier context. There were many who continued to underestimate her. I have a letter in my possession that belonged to my grandfather, who was a Labour councillor in 1975, speculating that Margaret Thatcher would not last very long as Tory leader, perhaps not even till the next general election. And yet she led the party for the next 15 years. So what did Margaret Thatcher do in those 4 long years as leader of the opposition to get herself in a position where she could lead the Conservatives into the stunning victory that was the 1979 election? How did she get the public to take her from being a derided figure who was most known for liking hats and snatching milk to someone they saw as a potential prime minister?
It's a great question, and one that's obviously very relevant to the Conservative Party now that it's in opposition again. The first thing she had to do was unite a party that had engaged in a bloody regicide, that had removed a leader by procedural means for the first time in its history. And she managed to do that for the most part. For example, she invited Whitelaw, a loyal man to Heath who stood in the second round, to become her deputy leader and subsequently Shadow Home Secretary. He helped become the glue that held the different parts of the Tory party together under her leadership, and he remained in her government after 1979 until ill health forced his resignation in 1988. And in the end, they got on pretty well. Whitelaw later recalled that she had always treated him with kindness and understanding, and Thatcher, for her part, felt, quote, "We couldn't do without Willie. He was a wonderful person." So by bringing people who hadn't supported her in the leadership election, both into the tent and hugging them close, she helped unite the party. The other key thing she did, and this is something which we're seeing actually from Kemi Badenoch as leader at the moment, is she talked in principles, not just policies. She was very determined that people would see her leadership as taking the Conservative Party in a different direction. This was not going to be continuity Heath, continuity Douglas Hume, continuity Macmillan. This was a fresh start for the Conservative Party. And she didn't just show that by talking about particular policies that she would implement, but by talking about her more libertarian, her more free market approach to governing the country and overseeing its economy, that in years to come would transform the political economy of the United Kingdom. But at that time, she was setting out very much the fundamental things that she believed in and showing how that could revive the party, revive conservatism, and also revive the country as well.
Well, I think every Conservative leader likes to think that they could be the next Margaret Thatcher, and time will tell if Kemi Badenoch can fit that bill. I would say that, of course, although Kemi Badenoch is the 4th woman to lead the Conservative Party, she's only the 2nd woman to lead the Conservative Party in opposition. And so she shares at least that similarity with Margaret Thatcher in a way that neither Theresa May nor Liz Truss had, because they became leader while the party was in government. And I think leader of the opposition is, as Harold Wilson once said, the toughest job in British politics. So we finish our podcast by looking at the books that we are reading at the moment. So Lee, tell us, what are you reading at the moment?
I thought that this week I would talk about Kingmaker by Graham Brady. This is his autobiography, basically, and includes his 14 years as chairman of the 1922 committee, the trade union of backbench Tory MPs, from 2010 to 2024. For most of his time in this role, Graham Brady could walk down almost any street in the country, totally unrecognised. But everything changed in 2016, when the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, and wrestling with the consequences of that decision and its aftermath, the Conservatives burned through 5 prime ministers in less than a decade. And Brady offers a dramatic and personal chronicle of these years in this book. If at first the title Kingmaker seems well chosen, Brady, after all, oversaw the election of 4 different Tory leaders. reading the book is a reminder that it was really regicide and not coronation where he made his mark. Instead of making kings and queens, Tory party leaders, it was Brady's job to break them. And he goes into some fascinating detail about how that came about. Sometimes his manner of doing so and of ending leaderships was almost comical. For example, with Liz Truss, the shortest of his leaders, of course, she said to him, "How bad do you think it is, Graham?" "I think it's very bad," he replied. Then she asked, "Do you think it's retrievable?" And he simply said, "I'm afraid I don't think it is." They'd come to the same conclusion, and her leadership was over. Another one had bitten the dust. Brady opted to leave Parliament at the last election and has since swapped the green leather of the House of Commons for the red leather of the House of Lords, from Sir Graham to Lord Brady. But his book, Kingmaker, is worth reading, in part for the lessons that it gives from a fairly long parliamentary career, 27 years in the House of Commons, but in particular for those 14 years as chairman of the 1922 committee. If there's a slight disappointment with the book, it's that it's fairly light on solutions to the chaotic merry-go-round that we've seen of Tory party leaders in recent years. His one big suggestion is to have an indicative vote between the final two, so that the preferences of the Tory party in Parliament are more clearly known to the membership. It's not a bad idea, it's probably a sensible thing to do, but it's not the silver bullet that would have prevented Tory chaos over the last sort of 5 years or so. So his successors may have to think a bit more adventurously if the party is to be rescued from its current dramas. But nevertheless, those dramas do make this book a gripping, if ultimately quite an unhappy, tale. So Richard, over to you. What are you reading at the moment?
I've been reading through the book Harold Wilson, The Winner by Nick Thomas-Symonds. Now, Nick Thomas-Symonds is someone with a pedigree in academic history at Oxford, who is now a member of the Labour cabinet as Paymaster General. Thomas-Symonds has written biographies of high-level Labour figures, Clement Attlee, Nye Bevan, and now Harold Wilson. It's a very fine biography. I've enjoyed reading it. There's another excellent biography of Harold Wilson by Ben Pimlett, which I also recommend. But actually, as I was reading through this biography, one of the senses I had from it is I would have liked Nick Thomas-Symonds to have perhaps not written yet another biography of Harold Wilson, given the great biography by Pimlett. But I wish that he directed his talents to perhaps write a biography of Mary Wilson, Harold Wilson's wife. I'm not aware that there is a biography of her. But Mary Wilson was an extraordinary individual. She, first of all, had an extraordinarily long life. She lived to at the age of 102. She died in 2018. And she had a front row seat of British politics from the Attlee Labour government, really right up until Brexit. And she was not someone who was particularly loved the limelight. She was a poet, and she did write books of poetry. But she was a woman who had her own political convictions and views. And I found it quite interesting. I was reading the passage in Nick Thomas-Symonds' book about the marriage of Harold and Mary Wilson, which last month was the 85th anniversary. And he writes that Mary Wilson refused to say "I obey" as part of her vows, which in 1940 might have been quite a feminist move. I think she also had a bit of a wry sense of humor. When they went on, she wanted to go on a honeymoon to the Scilly Isles, but because of the wartime context, Harold Wilson needed to be close to Oxford because he was working closely with William Beveridge. And so he only allowed them to go, or they only agreed to go as far as the village of Minster Lovel in the Cotswolds. And sort of, I think, in a little bit of a protest for this, the book that Mary Wilson brought with her to read on her honeymoon was the book Busman's Honeymoon, which I think is probably how she felt about their honeymoon from Oxford to Oxfordshire. So that's the book that I've been reading.
I see it's got an endorsement on the front by somebody called Sir Keir Starmer. Wonder whatever happened to him.
Don't hold that against it.
Well, that's all from us this week. Thank you very much for listening on to this retrospective about the 1975 Conservative leadership election. We'll be back next week with another podcast episode for you.
Thanks very much.